The Moscone Center buzzed with the electric energy of Silicon Valley's elite. Marcus Chen adjusted his rumpled blazer, the same one he'd worn to 3 investor meetings that week, each ending in polite rejection, and clutched his badge-marked general admission. Around him, venture capitalists in $1,000 suits mingled with startup founders whose confidence radiated from every gesture. He didn't belong here anymore, and everyone seemed to know it. 6 months ago, he'd been one of them. Now his company, Innovate Tech Solutions, was hemorrhaging money faster than he could raise it. The prototype that had once seemed revolutionary now felt like a relic, gathering dust in his cramped garage office while his savings account dwindled to double digits. But today was different. Today, he'd swallow his pride and network like his life depended on it, because it did. The lights dimmed as the keynote speaker took the stage. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Victoria Sterling stood at the podium, her red hair perfectly styled, her navy suit immaculate. She commanded the room with the same magnetic presence that had once drawn him in, back when they were partners in every sense of the word. Innovation requires integrity, Victoria began, her voice carrying effortlessly through the packed auditorium. When I founded Stellar Tech 3 years ago, I built it on a foundation of ethical leadership and genuine technological breakthroughs. Marcus's hands clenched into fists. When I founded Stellar Tech, the words echoed in his mind like a slap. It had been his algorithm, his sleepless nights, his breakthrough that made Stellar Tech possible. Victoria had been the business side, the schmoozer, the one who could charm investors while he coded in the background. Success isn't about cutting corners or taking credit for others' work. Victoria continued, and Marcus wondered if she could see him in the audience. It's about having the vision to see what others can't, and the courage to build something meaningful. The audience hung on her every word. Marcus watched as phone screens lit up with people taking notes, tweeting quotes, recording videos. His life's work was being celebrated, and his name was nowhere to be found. During the Q&A, a venture capitalist in the front row raised his hand. Victoria, there's been some speculation about Stellar Tech's origins. Can you tell us about your early team and how you developed the core technology? Marcus leaned forward, his heart hammering. This was it, the moment she'd acknowledge him, their partnership, their shared history. Victoria's smile never wavered. Well, David, every successful company has early contributors. We did work with various consultants during our development phase, including Marcus Chen. She gestured vaguely toward the audience. Marcus was a minor consultant who provided some coding assistance, but ultimately couldn't handle the pressure of scaling a real business. The core innovation, the algorithm that powers everything we do, that came from our internal team. The room's Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Minor consultant, couldn't handle the pressure. The lies flowed so smoothly from her lips that he almost doubted his own memories. Without thinking, Marcus stood up. That's not true. His voice cracked as it carried across the silent auditorium. Hundreds of faces turned toward him. Victoria, you know that's not what happened. I created that algorithm. Victoria's voice cut through his protest like ice. Her expression shifted from surprise to something between pity and annoyance. You're embarrassing yourself. And frankly, this is exactly the kind of unprofessional behavior that made our business relationship untenable. She turned to someone off stage. Security, could you please escort this gentleman out? I think he's had a difficult day. The laughter started as a few uncomfortable chuckles, but quickly spread through the audience like wildfire. Marcus felt his face burn as 2 security guards approached him, their expressions professional but firm. The sounds of the crowd whispers, snickers, the rustle of programs, created a symphony of humiliation that would echo in his mind for months. As they escorted him toward the exit, Marcus caught glimpses of faces, some amused, others uncomfortable, a few filming with their phone. But it was Victoria's expression that haunted him most, not anger or guilt, but something far worse. Indifference, as if he were nothing more than a minor inconvenience to be brushed aside. The heavy doors of the Moscone Center closed behind him with a finality that seemed to seal his fate. Standing alone on the sidewalk, Marcus realized the full scope of what had happened. Victoria hadn't just stolen his work, she'd erased him from history entirely. And now, in front of the entire tech industry, she'd made him look like a delusional failure. His phone buzzed with notifications, Twitter mentions, LinkedIn messages, text messages from former colleagues. The humiliation was already going viral. By tomorrow, everyone in Silicon Valley would know his name, but not for the reasons he'd hoped. Marcus walked slowly to his car, each step feeling like a mile. The injustice burned in his chest, but beneath the anger was something else. A cold, calculating fury that whispered promises of retribution. Victoria Sterling had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She'd underestimated him once before. She wouldn't get the chance to do it again. Marcus's garage had become a shrine to his former life. Boxes of documents, old laptops, and prototype hardware covered every surface, creating a maze of memories and evidence. He'd been searching for 3 days, surviving on coffee and determination, pulling together the pieces of a puzzle Victoria thought she'd destroyed. The breakthrough came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Buried in a box labeled Tax Documents 2022. Marcus found it, the original partnership agreement, signed by both him and Victoria, clearly outlining his ownership of the core algorithm. But more importantly, he found the email chain from 18 months ago, the one where Victoria had begged him to sign over his intellectual property rights temporarily for a funding round. Just until we close the Series A, she'd written. The investors want clean IP ownership. You'll get everything back plus equity once we're funded. Trust me, Marcus, we're in this together. He'd been an idiot to believe her. Blinded by love and partnership, he'd signed away his life's work for promises that evaporated the moment Stellar Tech's valuation hit $50 million. Marcus scrolled through more emails, his anger building with each revelation. There were messages where Victoria discussed phasing out Marcus's involvement with lawyers. Screenshots of her telling investors that she was the sole technical founder. Most damning of all, a recorded Zoom call where she admitted to her CFO that Marcus created the algorithm, but he's too naive for this industry. We need to protect the company from his idealism. She'd planned his betrayal from the beginning. His phone rang, startling him from his digital archaeology. The caller ID showed Sarah Kim, another name from his past that he'd been avoiding. Marcus, I saw what happened at the conference. Sarah's voice was gentle but urgent. I'm so sorry, I should have said something before now. Sarah had been Victoria's head of product development at Stellar Tech, one of the few people who knew the real story. When Victoria had pushed Marcus out, Sarah had kept her head down and her mouth shut, a decision that had clearly been eating at her. Why didn't you? Marcus found himself asking. You were there, you saw everything. Because I was scared, Sarah admitted. Victoria made it clear that anyone who supported you would be next. She had NDAs, non-compete clauses, the whole arsenal. I have a family, Marcus. I couldn't risk it. Marcus understood, but it didn't make the isolation any less painful. So why call now? Because what she did to you at that conference was unconscionable, and because, Sarah paused, because I know things about Stellar Tech's finance, about the corners Victoria's been cutting to maintain that growth rate everyone's so impressed with. Over the next hour, Sarah painted a picture of a company built on smoke and mirrors. Stellar Tech was burning through cash at an unsustainable rate, hiding losses through creative accounting, and Victoria was personally leveraging everything to maintain the illusion of success. The company that had stolen his life's work was actually drowning in debt. She's been taking high-interest bridge loans to cover operational costs, Sarah explained. The board doesn't know how bad it really is. Victoria's been shuffling money between accounts, delaying vendor payments, even holding back employee bonuses. The whole thing could collapse if anyone called in the debt. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, not quite hope, but something sharper. An opportunity. Sarah, I need you to send me everything you can about Stellar Tech's financial situation. Creditors, loan documents, payment schedule, everything. Marcus, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that Victoria taught me something important about this industry, he said, his voice gaining strength. She taught me that the person who controls the debt controls the company. Over the next week, Marcus became a student of financial warfare. He researched Stellar Tech's creditors, tracked down every bridge loan and line of credit, mapped out the company's cash flow like a general studying enemy territory. What he discovered was even better than he'd hoped. Stellar Tech owed money to 17 different entities, banks, private lenders, equipment financing companies, even a few desperate angel investors who'd been willing to take high-risk positions. The total debt was just over $3 million, spread across multiple creditors who were increasingly nervous about Victoria's ability to pay. The beautiful part was that most of these loans could be purchased at a discount. Creditors who were worried about default were often willing to sell debt to collections companies for 60 to 70 cents on the dollar, and if someone were to acquire enough of that debt, Marcus spent his last $20,000 on a consultation with a bankruptcy attorney who specialized in corporate acquisitions. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity: purchase Stellar Tech's debt from multiple creditors, then exercise his legal right to demand immediate payment. Victoria would have 48 hours to pay, or face bankruptcy proceedings. "It's perfectly legal," the attorney assured him. "Happens all the time in corporate finance. The only question is whether you can acquire enough debt to make it worthwhile." He'd liquidated his retirement account, sold his car, even borrowed against his house. By the end of the month, he'd quietly purchased $2.1 million of Stellar Tech's debt for $1.4 million, enough to destroy the company if Victoria couldn't pay. But Marcus wasn't interested in destruction. He was interested in justice, and he had a plan that would give Victoria exactly what she'd given him: a choice between her pride and her survival. The irony was perfect. Victoria had taught him that in Silicon Valley, the only thing that mattered was results. Well, she was about to learn what results looked like when the victim fought back with her own weapons. The acquisition process took Marcus 3 weeks of meticulous planning and careful maneuvering. He operated through shell companies and legal intermediaries, ensuring that Victoria would never see his name on any paperwork until it was too late. Each creditor presented a different challenge, but Marcus had learned patience during his months of failure, patience that now served him well. First was Pacific Bridge Capital, a private lending firm that had extended Stellar Tech a $400,000 line of credit. Their loan officer, Janet Chen, sounded tired when Marcus called under the guise of representing a debt collection agency. "Stellar Tech's been making minimum payments, but they're 60 days behind on their interest," she explained. "Honestly, we'd be happy to get 70 cents on the dollar and call it even." Marcus offered 75 cents and closed the deal within 48 hours. Next came the equipment financing companies. Stellar Tech had leased everything from servers to office furniture, and several lessors were growing nervous about the company's creditworthiness. Marcus's shell company, Meridian Financial Services, approached each creditor with the same story. They specialized in tech sector debt recovery and were looking to acquire performing loans at a slight discount. The beauty of the plan was its legitimacy. Every purchase was legal, every contract standard, every transaction exactly the kind of business-as-usual dealing that happened thousands of times daily in corporate finance. Marcus was simply a savvy investor making calculated bets on distressed debt. Within 2 weeks, he'd acquired $2.1 million of Stellar Tech's $3.2 million total debt load. More importantly, he'd structured the purchases so that all the debt would legally come due simultaneously if he chose to exercise his acceleration clauses. But acquisition was only the first phase. The second phase required a more delicate touch. Marcus reached out to Elena Rodriguez, a financial journalist at TechCrunch who'd written several pieces about startup financing irregularities. He fed her information carefully, never mentioning his own involvement, simply pointing her toward public records that raised questions about Stellar Tech's cash flow. "Have you looked at their latest quarterly filing?" Marcus suggested during an anonymous phone call. "The numbers don't quite add up. Might be worth investigating." Elena was a thorough reporter. Within a week, she'd published an article titled "Stellar Tech's Stellar Problems: When Growth Metrics Don't Tell the Whole Story." The piece didn't make any direct accusations, but it raised enough questions about the company's finances to make investors nervous. The market responded immediately. Stellar Tech's private valuation dropped 15% overnight as potential investors pulled out of funding discussions. Victoria's carefully constructed house of cards began to wobble. Marcus watched the drama unfold from his rebuilt home office, monitoring Stellar Tech's stock price, employee LinkedIn activity, and financial news coverage. Sarah kept him updated on the internal panic through encrypted messages. "Victoria's been in back-to-back meetings all week," Sarah reported. "She's trying to accelerate the next funding round, but the TechCrunch article spooked everyone. 2 board members have called for an independent financial audit." The pressure was building exactly as Marcus had planned. Now came the most dangerous part: direct contact. Marcus crafted his approach carefully. He couldn't appear vindictive or emotional. That would play into Victoria's narrative of him as an unstable ex-partner. Instead, he needed to seem like a successful businessman making a reasonable offer. He sent Victoria a LinkedIn message, professionally worded and deceptively casual. Hi Victoria, I know things have been complicated between us, but I've been following Stellar Tech's success and I'm genuinely impressed with what you've built. I'd like to discuss a potential investment opportunity that could be mutually beneficial. Would you be available for lunch this week? I think you might be surprised by what I have to offer. Victoria's response came within an hour. Marcus, I appreciate you reaching out. Given our history, I wasn't sure you were ready for a professional conversation. I'd be open to meeting, but I want to be clear that Stellar Tech isn't actively seeking individual investors at this time. Marcus smiled at her condescending tone. She still saw him as the same desperate man who'd been escorted from the conference. That blindness would be her downfall. They arranged to meet at Chez Laurent, an upscale French restaurant in Palo Alto where venture capitalists routinely made million-dollar deals over wine and duck confit. Marcus arrived early and chose a corner table where their conversation would be private but visible to the power brokers who frequented the establishment. Victoria swept in 15 minutes late, her entrance calculated for maximum impact. She wore a charcoal business suit that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, and her smile had the practiced warmth of a politician. Several diners recognized her, and Marcus watched her acknowledge their attention with subtle nods. Marcus, she said, settling into her chair with theatrical grace. You look well. I was worried about you after the conference. I've been busy, Marcus replied evenly, learning new things about the industry. It's fascinating how much happens behind the scenes that most people never see. Victoria's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. Yes, well, building a successful company requires understanding complexities that aren't always visible from the outside. The waiter took their orders. Victoria chose the most expensive entree on the menu naturally, and they made small talk about the tech industry, market conditions, and mutual acquaintances. Marcus played his role perfectly, the humbled entrepreneur seeking reconciliation and opportunity. So, Victoria said over her second glass of wine, you mentioned an investment opportunity. I have to say, I'm curious what you think you could offer Stellar Tech that we don't already have access to. Marcus reached into his briefcase and withdrew a leather portfolio. Actually, Victoria, I think there might be some confusion about who's offering what to whom. He opened the portfolio and slid a single document across the table. Victoria's expression shifted from condescension to confusion as she read the header, Notice of Debt Acceleration Stellar Tech Solutions, Inc. I don't understand, she said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. It's quite simple, Marcus explained, his tone remaining conversational despite the bombshell he was dropping. Over the past month, I've acquired $2.1 million of Stellar Tech's outstanding debt from various creditors. As of this morning, I'm exercising my right to demand immediate payment of all principal and accrued interest. Victoria's face went pale. That's not possible. Marcus slid additional documents across the table, purchase agreements, loan assignments, legal notice. Each page was meticulously prepared, each signature notarized, each clause bulletproof. You have 48 hours to pay, Victoria. If you can't, I'll be forced to begin bankruptcy proceedings against Stellar Tech. Marcus paused to sip his wine. Of course there is an alternative. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she rifled through the papers. What kind of alternative? Marcus reached into his briefcase once more and produced a check. He placed it face down on the table between them, his finger resting on the corner. This check is for $2.5 million, he said quietly. Enough to pay off the debt plus penalties, with some left over for your cash flow problems. It's yours, Victoria. All you have to do is take it. For a moment, Victoria's relief was visible. Then she looked at Marcus's expression and realized there was more. What's the catch? Marcus smiled, not with malice but with the quiet satisfaction of a chess player announcing checkmate. That's what we're going to discuss next. Victoria stared at the check as if it might burst into flames. The restaurant's ambient chatter faded into background noise as the reality of her situation crystallized. Marcus watched her mind work through the implications, seeing the exact moment when denial shifted to anger. This is extortion, she hissed, her polished composure cracking like ice under pressure. You can't seriously think. I can and I do, Marcus interrupted calmly. This is business, Victoria, the same kind of business you taught me when you stole my algorithm and rewrote history. Victoria's face flushed red. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You pathetic little man. Do you really think this changes anything? Do you think anyone will believe your version of events over mine? I don't need anyone to believe me, Marcus replied, sliding his phone across the table. On the screen was a recording app, clearly showing it had been running for the past 20 minutes. I just need them to hear your. Victoria's eyes widened as she realized she'd been recorded discussing the debt situation, her company's financial problems, and several unflattering comments about investors and employees. In California's two-party consent state, the recording might not be admissible in court, but it would be devastating if leaked to the press. "You're bluffing," she said, but her voice wavered. Marcus pocketed his phone and leaned back in his chair. "The conditions are simple, Victoria. You have 24 hours to decide. Take the check and accept my terms, or Stellar Tech dies tomorrow." Victoria shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Several nearby diners turned to look. "This isn't over, Mark. I don't know what you think you're playing at, but I built Stellar Tech from nothing. I won't let some bitter ex-boyfriend destroy everything I've worked for." "You built it from my algorithm," Marcus said quietly. "And I'm not your ex-boyfriend anymore, Victoria. I'm your creditor." Victoria stormed out, leaving Marcus to finish his meal alone. But her departure was just the beginning of the chaos to come. Within hours, Victoria had mobilized every resource at her disposal. She called an emergency board meeting, spinning the situation as a targeted attack by a disgruntled former employee. She reached out to her network of investors and advisors, painting Marcus as unstable and vindictive. "He's obsessed with me," she told Richard Hawthorne, Stellar Tech's lead investor. "This is clearly a personal vendetta masquerading as business. We need to explore our legal options." But Victoria's frantic attempts to raise emergency funding hit wall after wall. The TechCrunch article had already made investors nervous, and now word was spreading through Silicon Valley's tight-knit community that Stellar Tech was facing a debt crisis. The company that had seemed untouchable just days earlier was suddenly toxic. Sarah reported the internal chaos through encrypted messages. "Emergency all-hands meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning." Victoria's been screaming at people all day. "Legal department is working overtime, but they can't find any way to challenge the debt acquisition." Everything Marcus did was completely legitimate. Desperate, Victoria tried a different approach. She reached out to tech journalists, attempting to frame the story as a cautionary tale about vindictive former partners and the dangers of debt manipulation. But the financial press saw a different story. A successful startup brought low by hidden financial problems and poor management. Stellar Tech CEO fights hostile debt takeover, read the headline in the Valley Business Journal. The article detailed Victoria's claims about Marcus's motives, but also raised uncomfortable questions about how a supposedly successful company could be brought to its knees by a single creditor. Victoria's counterattack reached its peak when she posted a series of tweets attempting to discredit Marcus publicly. "Sometimes failed entrepreneurs become dangerous when they can't accept their own shortcomings. Personal vendettas have no place in professional business. Building something meaningful requires resilience against those who would tear down what they couldn't create." But the strategy backfired spectacularly. Tech Twitter, always hungry for drama, began digging into the backstory. Within hours, someone had found and shared the video of Marcus being escorted from the conference, along with Victoria's dismissive comments about him being a minor consultant. The narrative began to shift. Instead of a vindictive ex-partner attacking a successful woman, the story became one of stolen credit and delayed justice. Old Stellar Tech employees began coming forward anonymously, sharing stories about Victoria's treatment of early contributors and her tendency to rewrite history. Marcus watched the social media storm unfold from his home office, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and unease. This wasn't entirely what he'd planned. The public spectacle was overshadowing his careful, surgical approach to justice. His phone rang. Victoria's name appeared on the caller ID. "Marcus, we need to talk." Her voice was strained, the polished confidence replaced by barely controlled desperation. "This has gotten out of hand. The board is calling for my resignation. Our biggest client just pulled their contract." "You're not just hurting me, you're destroying hundreds of jobs." "I'm not destroying anything, Victoria," Marcus replied. "I'm offering you a lifeline, the same kind of lifeline you refused to throw me 6 months ago. What do you want?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. Marcus looked at the check sitting on his desk, the check that represented not just money, but power, vindication, and the chance to rewrite their story one final time. "Tomorrow morning you're going to call another all-hands meeting," he said, "and this time you're going to tell the truth." The line went dead. Victoria Sterling, the woman who had humiliated him in front of hundreds of people, who had stolen his life's work and rewritten their history, was finally going to face the consequences of her choices. But as Marcus sat in his quiet office, surrounded by the evidence of his meticulous planning, he wondered if victory would taste as sweet as revenge had promised. The Stellar Tech conference room had never felt smaller. Victoria stood at the head of the polished table facing the company's board of directors, senior staff, and via video conference, several key investors who had demanded to be present for what everyone knew would be a make-or-break moment. Marcus sat in the back corner, no longer the desperate outsider being escorted by security. Today, he held a briefcase containing legal documents that could end Stellar Tech with a single phone call. The check, now slightly crumpled from Victoria's nervous handling the night before, sat in front of him like a loaded weapon. "Before we begin," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "I want everyone to understand that what's happening here is unprecedented. We're being held hostage by someone with a personal vendetta." "Victoria," Marcus's voice cut through her prepared speech. "We agreed on the truth. Nothing else." Richard Hawthorne, the lead investor, looked between them with growing alarm. "Someone needs to explain what's going on here." "Victoria, you called this emergency meeting." "Marcus, I thought you were no longer associated with the company." Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. For months she'd controlled every narrative, shaped every story to her advantage. Now, faced with the choice between her carefully constructed lies and her company's survival, she found herself paralyzed. "Should I explain?" Marcus asked quietly, "or would you prefer to tell them yourself?" The room fell silent. Sarah Kim sat frozen at the table, knowing she was about to witness either Victoria's redemption or her complete destruction. The other employees shifted uncomfortably, sensing the undercurrent of something far more significant than a typical business dispute. Victoria closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, something fundamental had changed in her expression. The polished mask she'd worn for years was finally cracking. 3 years ago, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "Marcus Chen and I were partners. Not just business partners, we were going to build something together, something revolutionary." The words came slowly at first, like water from a leaking dam. Then, as the pressure built, they poured out in a torrent of long-suppressed truth. "Marcus created the algorithm that powers everything Stellar Tech does. Not our internal team, not me. Marcus, he spent 2 years perfecting it, working 18-hour days, believing in a vision that I helped him articulate but never truly understood." Victoria's voice grew stronger as she continued, as if confession were oxygen to someone who'd been drowning in lies. "When the venture capitalist wanted clean IP ownership, I convinced Marcus to sign over his rights temporarily. I told him it was just paperwork, that we'd protect his interests once we had funding. But I never intended to honor that promise." Richard Hawthorne's face had gone ashen. "Victoria, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I stole his life's work," Victoria replied, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. "I erased him from our story because I thought he was weak, that he couldn't handle the pressure of scaling a real business. I was wrong about his weakness, but I was right about one thing. He was better than this industry deserves, better than I deserved." Marcus felt something unexpected twist in his chest. This wasn't the grudging admission he'd anticipated, forced out by financial pressure. This was something rawer, more honest than he'd thought Victoria capable of. 6 months ago, at the TechCrunch conference, Marcus tried to set the record straight. "Instead of acknowledging what I'd done, I humiliated him publicly. I had him removed like he was some delusional stalker instead of the man whose brilliance built this company." The room erupted in whispers and shocked exclamations. Board members exchanged horrified glances. Several employees looked at Marcus with new understanding, finally connecting the dots between his public humiliation and his presence here today. "So when Marcus acquired our debt," Victoria continued, "when he put together this elaborate plan to force me to face consequences for my actions, he wasn't being vindictive. He was being just." Victoria turned to face Marcus directly. "You want me to choose between my pride and the company, don't you? Between admitting what I did and watching everything collapse?" Marcus held up the check. "The choice is yours, Victoria. It always has been." Victoria stared at the check for a long moment, then at the faces around the table, employees who had trusted her, investors who had believed in her vision, board members who were realizing they'd been built on a foundation of lies. "I choose the truth," she said finally. "I choose to step down as CEO, effective immediately. The company needs leadership it can trust, and after what I've done, that can't be me." She walked to where Marcus sat and reached for the check, but as her fingers touched the paper, Marcus pulled it back slightly. "There's one more thing," he said quietly. "This check isn't charity, Victoria. It's payment for something that was always mine." Victoria frowned, confused. "I don't understand." Marcus smiled, not with malice, but with a satisfaction that ran deeper than revenge. "The algorithm, Victoria, the intellectual property you stole. This check is me buying back what was always legally mine. The patents, the code, the rights to everything that makes stellar tech valuable. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Victoria had confessed to stealing intellectual property in front of witnesses. Now Marcus was offering to pay fair market value to reclaim it, making her theft not just morally wrong but legally untenable. So the choice isn't between your pride and the company, Marcus continued. It's between making this right and facing a lawsuit that will destroy everything anyway. Take the check, Victoria. Use it to rebuild something honest, something you can actually be proud of. Victoria's hand trembled as she reached for the check one final time. As her fingers closed around it, she felt the weight of 3 years of lies finally lifting from her shoulders. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she whispered, "for all of it." Marcus nodded once, then stood and walked toward the door. "I know you are, Victoria. That's why this ends here." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the lobby of his new office building, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as San Francisco Bay sparkled in the afternoon sun. The space was modest compared to Stellar Tech's former headquarters, but it was his, built on honest foundations and genuine partnerships. The business card in his hand read Chen Kim Innovations, with Sarah's name listed as co-founder and CTO. She joined him 2 weeks after the boardroom confrontation, bringing with her not just technical expertise but a shared commitment to the kind of ethical leadership they'd both learned to value through its absence. "The Meridian Group wants to move forward with Series A funding," Sarah announced, entering with a tablet full of good news. $20 million, with the understanding that we retain majority control and maintain our ethical guidelines. Marcus smiled, remembering when such numbers would have seemed impossible. Now they felt like validation not just of his technical abilities, but of his choice to pursue justice rather than destruction. The tech press had been kind to their story. "The Phoenix Rises: How One Developer Reclaimed His Legacy and Built Something Better," had been the headline in TechCrunch, written by Elena Rodriguez. The article detailed not just Marcus's technical brilliance, but his restraint in victory, how he could have destroyed Stellar Tech entirely but chose a path that preserved jobs and dignity. That restraint had paid dividends beyond money. The industry that had once laughed at his public humiliation now saw him as a symbol of integrity in a world often lacking it. Young entrepreneurs sought his mentorship. Investors valued his judgment. His calendar was full of speaking engagements about ethical leadership and intellectual property rights, but the most meaningful validation had come from an unexpected source. Marcus pulled out his phone and reread the email that had arrived that morning. "Marcus, I wanted you to know that I've accepted a position as Chief Technology Officer at a nonprofit focused on AI ethics in education. It's a significant step down in salary and status from where I was, but for the first time in years I feel like I'm building something I can be proud of. The therapy has helped. I'm learning to recognize the difference between ambition and greed, between confidence and arrogance. I'm learning that the person I became at Stellar Tech wasn't who I wanted to be. It was who I thought I needed to be to survive in an industry that often rewards the wrong behavior. I know I can never undo what I did to you, but I want you to know that your choice to show mercy instead of seeking destruction changed something fundamental in how I see myself in this industry. You could have ruined me completely, but instead you gave me the chance to rebuild honest. Stellar Tech is thriving under new leadership, by the way. The algorithm you created is being used to develop educational software for underserved communities. I think you'd be proud of what it's become. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to earn redemption, not from you but from myself." Victoria Marcus had read the email 3 times, each time feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction, sadness, and something approaching peace. Victoria Sterling, the woman who had stolen his work and humiliated him publicly, was finally becoming the person she might have been all along. The irony wasn't lost on him. His quest for justice had transformed them both, him into a more strategic thinker, her into a more honest person. The humiliation that had driven him to revenge had ultimately led to redemption for both of them. His phone buzzed with a calendar reminder: "Coffee with Alex, 3 p.m. Alex Chen was a young computer science graduate student at Stanford, who had reached out after reading about Marcus's story. She was working on machine learning applications for climate research, and wanted mentorship on both the technical and ethical aspects of bringing innovations to market." Marcus grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. As he walked through the office, he passed walls covered with patents, all bearing his name, all legally and ethically his. But more importantly, he passed a team of engineers and designers who believed in what they were building, who knew their contributions would be acknowledged and valued. The meeting with Alex went well. She was brilliant, passionate, and refreshingly naive about the darker aspects of the tech industry. Marcus found himself sharing not just technical advice, but the lessons he'd learned about protecting intellectual property, choosing the right partners, and maintaining integrity under pressure. How do you know when someone is trustworthy? Alex asked as their conversation wound down. Marcus thought about Victoria's confession in that boardroom, about Sarah's decision to finally speak truth to power, about his own choice between destruction and justice. You don't, he said finally, but you can control how you respond when trust is broken. You can choose to become bitter or you can choose to become better. The person who broke your trust gets to live with their choices, but you get to live with yours. As Marcus walked back to his office, he realized that his story had never really been about revenge. It had been about reclaiming not just his work but his sense of self-worth. Victoria had tried to erase him from history, but in fighting back he'd written a new chapter, one where justice prevailed not through destruction but through the patient application of truth. The check he'd handed Victoria that day had been for $2.5 million, but its true value was immeasurable. It had purchased his intellectual property, yes, but more importantly, it had bought him back his future. In Silicon Valley, where narratives were everything, Marcus Chen was no longer the man who'd been laughed at and escorted out. He was the man who'd fought back with dignity and won. That evening, as Marcus worked late in his office, he reflected on how different his life looked now compared to 6 months ago. He'd gained financial success, professional respect, and personal vindication. But perhaps most valuable of all, he'd learned that the best revenge wasn't destruction. It was building something so successful, so ethical, and so undeniably his that the truth could never be erased again. Victoria had laughed at him in front of everyone, but in the end Marcus had given her something far more valuable than humiliation. He'd given her the chance to become someone worth respecting, and in doing so he'd discovered that the sweetest victory wasn't over an enemy, it was over his own desire for revenge. The boy who'd been broken by betrayal had become a man who understood that true power lay not in destroying others, but in building something they could never take away.